Industry City. Industry City, also Busch Terminal, is a historic intermodal shipping, warehousing, and manufacturing complex on the upper New York Bay waterfront in the Sunset Park neighborhood of Brooklyn, New York City. The northern portion, commonly called Industry City on its own, hosts commercial light manufacturing tenants across 6 million square feet, 560,000 m2 of space between 32nd and 41st Streets, and is operated by a private consortium. The southern portion, known as Busch Terminal, is located between 40th and 51st Streets and is operated by the New York City Economic Development Corporation (NYCEDC) as a garment manufacturing complex. Founded by Busch Terminal Company head Irving T. Busch in the early 1900s, Busch Terminal was the first facility of its kind in New York City and the largest multi-tenant industrial property in the United States. The warehouses were built circa 1892–1910, the railroad from 1896 to 1915, and the factory lofts between 1905 and 1925. During World War I, Busch Terminal was used as a United States Navy base, though it returned to private ownership after the war. At its peak, Busch Terminal covered 200 acres, 81 hectares, bounded by Gowanus Bay to the west and north, 3rd Avenue to the east, 27th Street to the north, and 50th Street to the south. 171. The surrounding area entered a period of decline after World War II, and by the 1970s, the ports in Busch Terminal had been filled. The entire complex was rebranded as Industry City during the post-war years, though the Busch Terminal name remained in popular use. In the 1970s and 1980s, sections of Busch Terminal were demolished or converted into other uses, including a shopping mall, a federal prison, a privately operated manufacturing and commercial complex, and a garment manufacturing district operated by the NYCEDC. Today, the Busch Terminal site collectively comprises roughly 71 acres, 29 ha, including 16 former factory buildings and 11 warehouses built in the early 20th century. Starting in the 2010s, the complex has been undergoing renovations and expansions. A major expansion of Industry City, which would add 3 million square feet, 280,000 m2 of space to the complex, was announced in 2017. The section of Busch Terminal operated by the NYCEDC is also undergoing a renovation into the Made in NY campus, a film, TV, and fashion manufacturing complex that is set to open in 2020. Description: the privately owned Industry City complex covers 16 structures and 35 acres, 14 ha of land on the Brooklyn waterfront, adjacent to New York Harbor. It is subdivided into 8 former factory buildings between 2nd Avenue, 33rd Street, 3rd Avenue, and 37th Street, numbered 8 to 1 from north to south. An additional 2 buildings, numbered 19 and 20, occupy the block bounded by 1st Avenue, 2nd Avenue, 39th Street, and 41st Street. The structures contain a combined 6 million square feet, 560,000 m2 of floor space. All of the buildings were part of the Busch Terminal Company's industrial colony, which was built in the late 1900s and early 1910s. Directly south of Industry City, between 1st Avenue, 40th Street, 2nd Avenue, and 51st Street, is a collection of 11 former warehouses operated by the NYCEDC as part of the Busch Terminal manufacturing complex. These structures were developed by the South Brooklyn Industrial Development Corporation starting in 1989. The campus comprises 36 acres, 15 ha of land and 1,400,000 square feet, 130,000 m2 of renovated floor space. The entire complex was originally called Busch Terminal and formerly stretched further north. The section north of 32nd Street, comprising the former Naval Fleet Supply Base, is no longer part of Busch Terminal. One of the buildings between 29th and 31st Street, called Federal Building No. 2, are a privately owned shopping complex called Liberty View Industrial Plaza. It was bought by Salmon Properties in 2011, and before that it had been vacant since 2000. The site of the other structure, Federal Building No. 1, is occupied by Metropolitan Detention Center, Brooklyn MDC Brooklyn, which was built in the 1990s. Federal Building No. 1 was demolished in 1993 to make way for MDC Brooklyn. The South Brooklyn Marine Terminal, also owned by the NYCEDC, occupies the waterfront to the north and west from 39th to 29th Streets. Factory lofts. By 1918, the Busch Terminal Company owned 3,100 feet 940 m of waterfront in Brooklyn, and the terminal covered 20 waterfront blocks. The complex ultimately encompassed 16 factory buildings between 28th and 37th Streets and between 39th and 41st Streets. The buildings were outfitted with the most modern amenities available in the 1900s and 1910s, such as fireproof metal facades and a fire sprinkler system. The floors of each loft building could carry loads of up to 200 pounds per square foot, 980 kg/2. The loft buildings had a combined 150 freight elevators. They were mostly U-shaped to facilitate loading at the rail sidings located in between the two wings of each building. By the 1970s, the facilities buildings had 263,740 window panes in their walls and 138 miles, 222 km of fire sprinklers running within them. Busch Terminal Company Building. Industry City includes the Busch Terminal Company Building, now buildings 19 and 20, a loft structure located on 2nd Avenue between 39th. Construction on the building started around 1911. It was 8 stories tall with 3 distinct buildings connected in U-shaped manner. The primary structure possessed a common courtyard with wings. The structure had a frontage of 460 feet on the west side of 2nd Avenue. Its wings ran westward from 2nd Avenue along 39th Street and 40th Street. It extended 335 feet each to a private street located off the bulkheads. The court measured 210 feet by 55 feet. The property on which the edifice was erected was purchased in part from the New York Dock Company for $30 million. The building's completion was part of a plan long contemplated by the Busch Terminal Company's president, Irving T. Busch. 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 Its construction coincided with an improvement in the industrial region between 1st and 2nd Avenues. The Busch Terminal Company erected structures like this on both sides of 2nd Avenue. Railroad. The Busch Terminal Railroad Company owned about 20 miles 32 km of track within the terminal by 1917, which had grown to 43 miles 69 km of track by 1950. The terminal's railroad greatly reduced shippers' cost to haul freight from their facilities to a rail yard. The rail yard could hold about 1,000 freight cars and was 6 blocks long. The terminal also owned 2 miles 3.2 km of double-tracked electric railroad that ran on the streets along Brooklyn's waterfront. The tracks ran along 2nd Avenue from 28th to 41st Streets and along 1st Avenue from 41st to 64th Streets, with spurs into every factory building and into the Brooklyn Army Terminal at 58th Street. Eventually, Busch Terminal could handle 50,000 freight railcars at a time. 170 when the tracks connected with the Pennsylvania Railroad's New York Connecting Railroad at 65th Street, south of the Brooklyn Army Terminal. There was also a direct connection to the Brooklyn Rapid Transit Company's trackage at 39th Street, which is now operated by the South Brooklyn Railway. Around 1913, there were plans to extend the railroad northward along the Brooklyn waterfront via the marginal elevated railway. The railroad would have used an elevated viaduct, similar to the High Line in Manhattan, between Busch Terminal and the piers at Fulton Ferry Landing, now Brooklyn Bridge Park in Brooklyn Heights. However, this marginal railroad was never built. In addition, The Busch Terminal Company ran a car float operation in which freight cars were loaded aboard car float barges with railroad tracks, which traveled across New York Harbor to and from car float piers in New Jersey. The company had a fleet of tugboats specifically for car floats, each with 3 crews. Each tug pulled 3 or 4 car float barges, which each measured 277 by 41 feet 84 by 12 m and could hold up to 17 freight cars at a time. By 1957, 2 tugboats were still operating, both of which dated to 1905 and 1906. Piers and Storage. In its most active years, the Busch Terminal/Industry City complex contained 7 covered piers, which each extended over 1,200 feet 370 m into New York Harbor. Each pier measured 1,400 by 150 feet 427 by 46 m and contained a railroad track for loading freight onto ships. Adjacent to each pier were slips that measured 270 feet 82 m wide by 40 feet 12 m deep, large enough to accommodate container ships at the time. 25 steamship lines used these piers, 171, and by 1910, Busch Terminal handled 10% of all steamships arriving in New York. Once freight was offloaded from vessels or ready for shipment, it could be stored within one of the warehouses at Busch Terminal. Estimates varied as to the number of warehouses at Busch Terminal. According to the New York Times, the complex had 118 warehouses by 1918, ranging in height from 1 to 8 stories, which could store a combined 25 million cubic feet 710,003 of goods. However, the Wall Street Journal described the terminal later that year as having 121 warehouses with 38 million cubic feet 1,100,003 of total storage space, and a 1920 article in the Busch Company's magazine mentioned that the complex had 122 warehouses. 32 the warehouses were used to store both raw and manufactured goods from Manhattan, in addition to materials offloaded from incoming ships and merchandise headed for distribution. The Busch Terminal Company also maintained a fleet of 4 steam lighters and 7 tugboats that carried goods between the terminal and piers in Manhattan. By 1920, distribution was controlled from an 8-story steel and concrete service building at 39th Street west of 2nd Avenue. The building had 2 levels of railroad tracks, one for incoming freight and one for outgoing freight, and each level could accommodate 6 freight cars. 3435. Historic operations, Renovations. When the complex was known as Busch Terminal, it offered economies of scale for its tenants so that even the smallest interests had available to them the type of facilities normally only available to large, well-capitalized firms. An article published in the Brooklyn Daily Eagle in 1940 mentioned that tenants took up anywhere between 5,000 to 130,000 square feet 460 to 12,080 into of space. During the 1910s, advertisements for Busch Terminal were posted in newspapers such as the Brooklyn Daily Eagle. The advertisements claimed that companies could have private railroad tracks, a free waterfront, and $1 million factory at your present rental or less, and stated that the Busch Terminal complex covered over 200 acres 81 ha of land. Other advertisements by the Busch Terminal Company depicted companies that were moving to Busch Terminal in large numbers and claimed that the Busch Terminal Company was boosting Brooklyn. Busch Terminal employed 35,000 workers by 1928, and the vice president of the Busch Terminal Company had created a court system for Busch Terminal as a form of self-policing. There were 4 tribunals, one each for marine employees, railroad workers, trucking employees, and mechanical employees. These handled both civil cases, such as those for job demotions seen as unfair, and criminal cases, such as those for fraud. There was also a Supreme Court that handled disputes between departments, and employees were allowed to appeal cases directly to Irving Busch. Irving Busch, 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 Irving Busch. Irving Busch. The terminal also had a pivot club, which was composed of longshoremen who met twice a week to draft legislation for Busch Terminal. Busch Terminal had two coal and oil power plants for steam and light, which provided the complex's power. In addition, the terminal contained a hall for longshoremen, a bank, restaurants, and a trolley system to provide transportation for workers. An administration building was constructed circa 1895-1902. Busch Terminal also had its own police force and fire department, 171, as well as a mailbox for airmail. A Chamber of Commerce for Busch Terminal, created in June 1916, had successfully advocated for improvements to the Busch Terminal area, such as infrastructure improvements and quality of life cleanup. Other amenities provided at Busch Terminal included social clubs, schools, and community centers. History. Concept and beginnings. Industry City was originally known as Busch Terminal, which was named after Irving T. Busch. T. Busch, 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 T. Busch. His family name came from Jan Bosch, who was born in the Netherlands and immigrated to New Amsterdam, now New York, in 1662. It is unrelated to the Busch political family. Busch Terminal was unique from other rail marine terminals in New York due to its distance from Manhattan, the magnitude of its warehousing and manufacturing operations, and its fully integrated nature. Wholesalers in Manhattan faced expensive time, transportation, and labor costs when importing and then resending goods. In 1895, Irving T. Busch, working under his family's company, the Busch Company, organized 6 warehouses and 1 pier on the waterfront of South Brooklyn as a freight handling terminal. There had only been 1 warehouse on the Busch Terminal site in 1890, 171 before that. The land contained an oil refinery belonging to the Busch and Denslow Company of Rufus T. Busch, Irving T. Busch's father. Standard Oil bought this refinery in the 1880s and dismantled it, but after Rufus T. Busch's death in 1890, Irving T. Busch later bought the land back using his father's inheritance. In 1891, the Busch Company completed a 1-story office building at the intersection of First Avenue and 42nd Street. Irving Busch built 6 warehouses on the site between 1895 and 1897, but soon observed their inefficiency. The ships were on one shore, the railroads on another, and the factories were scattered about the city on any old street without any relation to either kind of transportation. I thought, why not bring them to one place and tie? Railroad officials would not ship directly to Brooklyn unless the customers first had orders of freight, as it required the extra cost of loading freight cars on car floats for the trip across New York Harbor to the ferry slips at the terminal. Railroad officials also feared that the harbor might freeze during the winter, making a car float unsustainable. Irving T. Busch resorted to sending an agent to Michigan with instructions to buy 100 carloads of hay, then to attempt to have the hay sent in its original rail car to Busch's terminal in Brooklyn. Railroad companies in the eastern U.S. declined their western agents' request to send the hay until the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad agreed to accept the offer and negotiate directly with the new terminal, after which other railways followed. To demonstrate that ocean vessels could dock at the piers, Irving T. Busch leased ships and entered the banana business, and in doing so made a profit. Likewise, to induce businesses to store goods at his terminal's warehouses, he warehoused coffee and cotton himself. Once Busch Terminal succeeded and expanded, sources credited Busch's keen foresight for undertaking such a quixotic business venture. Expansion. 1900s and 1910s. The Busch Company purchased an additional plot of land from the Hunt family in 1901, spanning between 41st and 50th Streets. At the time, the company already operated properties at the western ends of 41st and 42nd Streets, facing the waterfront. The Busch Company terminal business became the Busch Terminal Company in 1902 when Irving T. Busch bought the land from the Standard Oil Company. The same year, the Busch Terminal Company started grading land on the former Hunt estate. It was ultimately planning to construct 18 factory loft buildings and 73 warehouses, as well as 7 piers. The first pier opened in May 1903. Significant progress had been made by 1905. 5 of the piers were complete, and the Busch Terminal Company owned 10 of the 12 blocks of waterfront between 39th and 51st Streets, as well as the plot bounded by 2nd Avenue, 3rd Avenue, 37th Street, and 28th Street. A 6th pier was completed within 2 years. By this time, the shipping industry in Manhattan was becoming congested. By early 1909, 3 of the factory structures had been completed and a 4th was under construction. Each building was 6 stories tall, measured 600 by 75 feet, 183 by 23 m. The complex was convenient enough for industries that the first 2 buildings had been fully rented before they had even been completed. The Busch Terminal Company also arranged to lease a tenement structure at 3rd Avenue and 29th Street to house workers employed at Busch Terminal. It was expected that by the time 15 to 20 of the factories were completed, Busch Terminal would employ 10,000 to 15,000 workers. Plans for a 5th and 6th factory building were announced in Midminus 1909. Early tenants included those in the printing and paper industries, and many of these tenants would remain through the 1950s. In 1912, Irving Busch proposed that the city buy the Busch Terminal Company's piers, since the city had desired to purchase the company's waterfront land. Later that year, the New York City Board of Estimate received a proposal for the city to establish a freight terminal on the Brooklyn waterfront between 36th and 43rd Streets and purchase that stretch of land from the Busch Terminal Company, as well as the Busch Terminal Railroad and the entirety of Busch Terminal at the time. Under the plan, the existing Busch Terminal, the railroad, and the new city-owned terminal would continue to be operated by the Busch Terminal Company. That September, a special committee for the Board of Estimate approved the plan. However, the New York Merchants Association opposed the city's proposal to purchase Busch Terminal, because the Busch Terminal Company would then have a monopoly on the railroads along the Brooklyn waterfront. The city's Commissioner of Docks, Calvin Tompkins, also opposed the proposal because of concerns over a private monopoly, and because the Board of Estimate's special committee had ignored his original proposals. By 1917, Busch Terminal had 26,500,000 cubic feet, 750,003 of storage spread across 102 warehouses. The Busch Terminal Company had built 16 factory loft buildings with a combined floor area of 4,500,000 square feet, 420,002. Use by Navy during World War I. On December 31, 1917, the United States Navy announced that it would take over the piers and warehouses of the Busch Terminal Company. Major General George Goethals, acting Quartermaster General of the U.S. Army, praised Busch Terminal as being among the best shipping facilities in the United States. The Navy proposed to build 6 million square feet, 560,002 of storage space, and 4 piers adjoining Busch Terminal. The United States Army also occupied warehouses within part of Busch Terminal, but it proposed to vacate that space so the Navy could use it. The U.S. Navy wanted to outright purchase Busch Terminal, and it was soon in negotiations with the Busch Terminal Company over the terminal's valuation. In June 1918, Assistant Secretary of the Navy and eventual President of the United States, Franklin D. Roosevelt, wrote to Irving Busch to tell him that the Navy would also be commandeering 4 of Busch Terminal's 12 manufacturing buildings. As a result, 64 manufacturers employing 4,500 people were ordered to vacate their spaces by the end of 1918. The eviction notice covered 276 total tenants in buildings 3, 4, 5, and 6. Although Busch reluctantly complied with the takeover, the Merchants Association protested because the takeover would eliminate the jobs of a large workforce. Many companies at Busch Terminal also pushed back against the eviction order, citing the amenities at the terminal. The Busch Terminal Company recorded material losses. The next year, the U.S. Navy tied its rail lines into those of the Busch Terminal. Irving Busch helped to design Busch Terminal's southern neighbor, the Brooklyn Army Terminal, which was completed in 1919. Because of the railroad connection between Busch Terminal and the Brooklyn Army Terminal, and then to the mainland U.S. via the New York Connecting Railroad, the U.S. Navy wanted to operate the Busch Terminal for the duration of the war, paying a fee for the takeover. The piers of the terminal became part of the United States Army's New York port of embarkation. At the war's end, the port of embarkation included 8 piers in Brooklyn, including 6 Busch Terminal piers and 2 Army Supply Base piers, 120 Busch Terminal warehouses, 12 piers and 7 warehouses in Hoboken, New Jersey, and 3 piers in the North River, Manhattan. A 1929 article in the Brooklyn Daily Eagle mentioned that during World War I, Busch Terminal handled about 70% of the ammunition, clothing, and food that went to American soldiers abroad. The federal government quietly returned Busch Terminal to private ownership after the war. It paid out claims to the Busch Terminal Company for the use of the terminal space, though the last of the funds was not allocated until 1943. 25 years after takeover. In October 1919, the Busch Terminal Company announced the creation of a department for sporting goods manufacturers at Busch Terminal. The company was designated with selling off excess cloth from the Army and Navy, which were considered war surplus. Zenith. 1920s. The 12 factory loft buildings that had been built by 1918 housed about 300 companies. By the end of World War I, Busch Terminal was an integral part of the economy of what is now Sunset Park. 1143–1144 the terminal's fortunes rose with those of the borough of Brooklyn, which had over 2.5 million residents by 1930. 152 Busch Terminal employed thousands directly and many thousands more worked for firms within Busch Terminal. 171 by 1928. Busch Terminal had 35,000 workers, and it was so large that the terminal employed its own court system, as well as a police force and fire department. 171 World War I had halted expansion projects at Busch Terminal, and construction on these projects did not resume until 1926. In March 1927, the Busch Terminal Company completed 600,000 square feet 56,002 of new industrial space at Busch Terminal, bringing the amount of factory loft space to 5,600,000 square feet 520,002. By that time, the company was constructing 2 additional loft buildings, which would increase the factory loft space by 10%, as well as power plant at Busch Terminal. A branch of National City Bank, now Citibank, inside the terminal was opened the same year, as did a playground near the terminal. Other Busch Terminal Company buildings. Early in the 20th century, the Busch Terminal Company commissioned architects Kirby, Petit and Green to design its headquarters building in Manhattan's financial district at 100 Broad Street, near the intersection with Pearl and Bridge Streets. The relatively small yet notable 5-story office building was located on the site of Manhattan's first church, built in 1633, and one book described the structure as having a Gothic design with a strong flavor of Dutch. The company also funded construction of Busch Tower, a 30-story skyscraper near Times Square in Manhattan, where tenants of the Busch Terminal Company attempted a similar melding of commercial displays and social space at Busch House in London, built in 3 phases during the 1920s, but the concept was not fully carried through at that project. Great Depression and World War II. Despite the onset of the Great Depression in 1929, the Busch Terminal Company was initially unaffected. In early 1930, Irving Busch created a new subsidiary, the Busch Services Corporation, which would allow small manufacturers in Busch Terminal to sell directly to manufacturers, thus eliminating the need for wholesalers as middlemen. Later that year, a direct seaplane route was established between Busch Terminal and Philadelphia. In 1931, in advance of a projected increase in business, the Busch Terminal Company planned to purchase $500,000 to help potential tenants and customers find Busch Terminal more easily. Wayfinding signs for the terminal were installed in the 36th Street subway station. A park at the site of an abandoned dumping ground was announced in 1934, and the Busch Terminal Company bought a fleet of new trucks for Busch Terminal the same year. In mid-March 1933, 7 members of the Busch Terminal Company's board suddenly quit, citing past mismanagement. The Busch Terminal Company went into receivership 2 weeks afterward, on April 1, 1933, due to an inability to repay its outstanding bonds. A new 11-person board of directors was appointed for the duration of receivership. The receivers started cutting costs and by May had eliminated $100,000 in expenses. In May 1935, the receivers removed Busch as the president of the Busch Terminal Company and subsidiaries. Shortly afterward, Busch unsuccessfully sued in Brooklyn federal court to have the receivers removed based on an accusation of incompetence. That November, stockholders filed a petition in Brooklyn federal court to reorganize the Busch Terminal Company, since the company was bankrupt. The reorganization was granted by Brooklyn federal judge Robert Alexander Inch. The company exited receivership on May 1, 1936. However, equity proceedings against the Busch Terminal Company were still pending, and in April 1937, the Busch Terminal Buildings Company filed for reorganization under a court order from Inch. Legal disputes between Busch and the trustees continued, including a libel suit filed by the trustees against Busch that later had to be relitigated. Operations at the terminal itself continued relatively unaltered through the 1930s. However, vacancy rates reached as high as 35% during the Depression. The United States Postal Service decided to relocate the area's post office out of Busch Terminal in 1934 because the rent was too high. At some point, the Drug Enforcement Administration, the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives, the Internal Revenue Service, and the United States Coast Guard also occupied space in Busch Terminal. In 1938, after lithographers signed leases for 9 buildings in Busch Terminal, the Busch Terminal Company announced that the leased buildings would receive extensive renovations. The federal government, whose Works Progress Administration stored supplies such as clothing in warehouses at Busch Terminal, was another large tenant. Other large tenants included the Monarch Wine Company, which leased 3 buildings at Busch Terminal in 1939, and spice companies such as the Great Atlantic and Pacific Tea Company, now NP, whose Busch Terminal tea packing plant was once the world's largest. By 1941, 90% of the rentable space at Busch Terminal had been leased, and 69 of 71 story buildings had been rented. During World War II, some buildings in Busch Terminal were again used by the federal government, which used 1,500,000 square feet, 140,000 m2 of storage space at the terminal. In mid-1941, the U.S. Army moved some civilian workers into more than 500,000 square feet, 46,000 m2 at Busch Terminal, spread across 3 buildings along First Avenue because there was no more space at Brooklyn Army Terminal. Franklin D. Roosevelt's 1944 presidential campaign tour around New York City, which occurred in October 1944, started at the Brooklyn Army Terminal and Busch Terminal. After World War II, Sunset Park began to suffer economic decline during the Great Depression, which worsened with the demolition of the Fifth Avenue elevated. Busch Terminal and the Sunset Park waterfront were disconnected from the rest of the neighborhood by the 1941 construction and subsequent widening of the Gowanus Expressway Interstate 278 above Thur. After the war, white flight, the maritime industries moved to New Jersey, and the 1966 deactivation of the Brooklyn Army Terminal also hurt the neighborhood, until it was reopened as an industrial park in the 1980s. 1143–1144, however, Busch Terminal still remained active around this time, although it was smaller compared to before World War II. The opening of the Brooklyn Battery Tunnel in 1950 gave Busch Terminal and the surrounding area a direct link to Manhattan, which was seen as a benefit to the area's economy. Late 1940s and early 1950s. In 1946, the administration of Mayor William O'Dwyer proposed building a food produce market at Busch Terminal. The existing Brooklyn Terminal Market in Canarsie, Brooklyn, was too far away from convenient railroad connections, and the Busch Terminal Market would compete with the Bronx Terminal Market in the Bronx, which was close to rail connections. However, the proposal to build a market at Busch Terminal was controversial among merchants because it would take profits away from the Brooklyn Terminal and Bronx Terminal markets, as well as from the Washington Terminal Market in Manhattan. And it was ultimately not built. Irving T. Busch died in 1948. In his will, he stipulated that all Busch Terminal profits that went to him would go to a trust fund for one of his nieces. Busch was succeeded by A. P. Timmerman as chairman of Busch Terminal Company and by J. L. Hannigan as president of the company. A statue to him was dedicated in 1950 at Busch Terminal's administration building. By that year, the Busch Terminal Company only employed about 700 people, though about 40,000 people either were directly supported by jobs at Busch Terminal or lived nearby. The company had 300 manufacturing tenants spread across 120 buildings. In 1951, the Busch Terminal Company's real estate, shipping, and industrial divisions were merged with the real estate company Webb and Knapp, though the Busch Terminal Buildings Company remained separate. As part of the merger, $5 million in improvements was proposed for Busch Terminal, and the management of the Busch Terminal Company was allowed to continue operating as normal. It was around this time that the president of the Busch Terminal Buildings Company, R. A. P. Walker, started advertising the terminal's buildings in newspapers as Industry City. The Industry City name was a reference to Busch Terminal becoming one of the first industrial parks in the United States following World War II. After the Brooklyn Battery Tunnel opened, the area around Industry City became so congested with traffic that, in 1953, the vice president of the Busch Terminal Merchants and Manufacturers Association proposed traffic. By Industry City's 50th anniversary in 1955, it employed 25,000 workers working for over 100 companies, and 25 tenants occupied 41% of the 6 million square feet at the complex. More than three-quarters of the tenants, 78%, had been at Busch Terminal for more than 10 years, and 10% had occupied space there for more than 40 years. Major tenants included NP, which roasted much of its coffee at Industry City, Beechnut, which made candy and chewing gum, Virginia Dare, which made wine and flavoring extract, and two of the largest olive oil producers in the U.S., according to the New York Times. On December 3, 1956, Industry City was the site of what might have been the largest explosion in New York City history. Dock workers were using an oxyacetylene torch to perform routine maintenance work when, at about 3:15 p.m. that day, sparks ignited 26,365 pounds 11,959 kg of ground foam rubber scrap. Employees abandoned initial efforts to control the blaze. 26 minutes later, the fire reached 37,000 pounds 10,000 kg of cordodetonant fuse, setting off an explosion. Earlier in the day, the burlap bags holding an additional 11,415 pounds 5,178 kg of rubber scrap had broken, and investigators believed that pieces of the highly inflammable scrap had been strewn across the dock. The blast resulted in 10 deaths, including that of a man standing 1,000 feet 300 m away, 274 injuries, and major destruction in a 1,000-foot radius, including broken windows in buildings up to 1 mile 1.6 km away. People reported hearing the explosion as far as 35 miles 56 km away. However, none of the firefighters on land or water were injured because the shrapnel went over their heads. The follow-up report suggested several changes in policy to prevent similar future accidents, such as fire risk training for all dock workers and special markings for explosives. Damage from the explosion is still apparent at Industry City. Iron on the fire escapes is mangled, and several windows contain embedded shrapnel. From the early 1950s through the 1960s, the Topps Company, which primarily made chewing gum and baseball cards, manufactured baseball cards at Industry City. Topps moved production to Pennsylvania in 1965, though its offices remained in Busch Terminal until 1994, when it moved to Manhattan. A major tenant, the Norton Lilly Company, among the city's largest shipping companies, moved out of the terminal in 1957, having occupied Busch Terminal since 1902. Late 1950s renovations and 1960s. In 1957, the city announced that a marine terminal for the Mitsui Steamship Company would be built near Industry City between 36th and 39th Streets. In conjunction with the construction of the Mitsui terminal, the pier at 35th Street, which had been wrecked in the Busch terminal explosion the previous year, was rebuilt. The Mitsui terminal opened in 1960. As part of the modernization of Busch Terminal/Industry City, the Busch Terminal Company also renovated two railroad car float bridges in 1960 and 1963. The construction of a container ship pier between 19th and 36th Streets along the northern section of Industry City was approved in 1967. This later became the South Brooklyn Marine Terminal. Since its early years, the Busch Terminal Company had funded its Busch Terminal operations with investments in various companies. After Irving Busch's death, the company began buying larger interests in various companies. In 1961, the Busch Terminal Company had sold its 37% stake in the General Cigar Company, in which it had held stock for 7 years, and used these funds to purchase stock in the Hamilton Watch Company and the New Jersey Zinc Company. The same year, the Busch Terminal Company sold its Lower Manhattan headquarters building, which was soon demolished, and consolidated its offices at Industry City. A real estate group led by billionaire real estate figure Harry Helmsley bought Industry City in 1963. In turn, the Busch Terminal Company was acquired by Universal Consolidated Industries in 1968, and the combined company became the Busch Universal Corporation. Decline of port. Shipping activity at Busch Terminal had gradually declined after World War II due to the introduction of containerized shipping and the construction of the Port Newark Elizabeth Marine Terminal in New Jersey. In February 1969, the Busch Universal Corporation announced that pier operations between 39th and 52nd Streets would cease by the end of the year. That October, the company also applied to the Interstate Commerce Commission to discontinue the Busch Terminal Railroad due to a continuing decline in profits. In June 1970, the city government bought 100 acres (0.40 km2) of land in Busch Terminal between 39th and 50th Streets for $8.05 million and leased the land to private companies. The city planned to make a container ship facility at Busch Terminal, and so it was expected that this would create 500 to 1,000 jobs for longshoremen. The Busch Terminal Railroad was officially abandoned in December 1971, despite protests from railroad workers. The last remaining tugboat in the car float operation, the Irving T. Busch, was also retired at the same time. Car float and cargo transloading activities moved to the nearby 65th Street Yard and, along with the Busch Terminal Rail Yard, were taken over by New York. The New York Dock Railroad was given a temporary permit to operate on the former Busch Terminal tracks until the city took title to the railroad in August 1973. New York Dock subsequently started leasing the tracks, and a direct track connection through the Brooklyn Army Terminal to the Bay Ridge branch was established. Improvements to the tracks at and leading to Busch Terminal were announced in 1977, by which time the tracks had deteriorated. The tracks were later extended to the South Brooklyn Marine Terminal, adjacent to Industry City. They are now used occasionally to transport New York City subway rolling stock via the South Brooklyn Railway. By 2016, the Panage intended to reopen the adjacent 51st Street Yard. In 1974, the City of New York Department of Ports and Terminals hired a private company to fill the spaces between Piers 1 through 4 to make space for parking shipping containers. Filling continued through the 1975 New York City fiscal crisis, and builders paid the city for the right to infill the piers. However, the filling operations were halted in 1978 after reports of environmental violations. New York City officials later learned that toxic wastes, including oil sludge, and wastewater had been dumped at the site, making the four piers a polluted brownfield. In 2006, Mayor Michael Bloomberg and Governor George Pataki announced a $36 million plan to clean up and redevelop the Busch Terminal piers. The plan included a $17.08 million grant from the state of New York, the largest single grant the state had ever awarded to clean up a brownfield site. As part of a reduction in military operations, in 1976 the federal government proposed moving its Navy Resale Systems office from Busch Terminal to Illinois. The office ultimately stayed at Busch Terminal after the rent was lowered. Redevelopment, 1980s and 1990s. The privately operated portion of Industry City maintained 95% occupancy through the mid-1970s and was 98% occupied by 1980. By 1976, its tenants included 125 companies that employed 20,000 people, growing to 135 companies by 1980. However, there were also fewer tenants than in its peak years between World Wars I and Roman II, partially because much of the space was being used for storage. These companies took up 89% of the 6 million square feet of factory loft space by 1985. The city-operated section of Busch Terminal employed 7,000 people by 1977, and the improvements to the tracks were slated to add 3,000 more jobs. During the 1980s, Industry City housed the highest concentration of garment manufacturers in New York City outside of Manhattan. By 1985, 30% of the factory loft space at Industry City, 1,800,000 square feet, 170,002 was rented by garment manufacturers, mainly because of high rents in Manhattan's garment district, as rents per square foot at Industry City were about half those in the garment district. A new structure, the first to be built in the complex in several decades, was also under construction at Industry City, replacing another structure destroyed by fire. Industry City Associates bought the 35-acre 14-ha complex from Helmsley Syndicate in March 1986. Shortly afterward, Industry City Associates filed plans to convert 650,000 square feet, 60,000 m2 of space in Industry City. However, this conversion was never carried out. The Federal Bureau of Prisons proposed converting two buildings at Industry City into a federal jail in 1988 due to overcrowding at the Manhattan Detention Complex. There was large opposition from members of the local community, who feared that traffic congestion in the area would rise. The prison, now Metropolitan Detention Center, Brooklyn, was approved in 1993 in spite of the community's objections. To make room for MDC Brooklyn, Federal Building No. 1 was destroyed in a controlled explosion in August 1993. In 1991, the New York City government proposed placing a sludge disposal plant at Busch Terminal. The $225 million plant would have been located on the west side of First Avenue between 47th and 51st Streets. It would have been one of 5 total sludge plants placed in each of the city's boroughs. The plan was withdrawn in 1993 due to large opposition from the surrounding community, which brought up issues about the pollution and loss of jobs that would be caused by the sludge plant. NYCEDC's Busch Terminal redevelopment. By the 1980s, the section of Busch Terminal between 41st and 50th Streets was derelict with large populations of squatters and prostitutes, and it was a popular place for dumping dead bodies. The city allowed the Southwest Brooklyn Industrial Development Corporation (SBID) to develop 1,500,000 square feet, 140,000 into of space, spread across 11 warehouses, in this part of Busch Terminal in 1989. The New York City Economic Development Corporation (NYCEDC) started leasing 3 of the city-owned buildings at Busch Terminal in the 1990s. The SBID, in conjunction with the NYCEDC, cleaned up and renovated the Busch Terminal structures. By 1998, the 11 warehouses were at 100% occupancy, and they collectively housed 150 tenants. In 1997, the city also provided some funding to repurpose parts of one building in Busch Terminal as a business incubator. In 2006, the NYCEDC proposed the sale to developers of the 3 warehouse buildings that it leased. Following the 2009 rezoning of Sunset Park, the NYCEDC started soliciting requests for proposals to redevelop the 3 buildings with a collective area of 130,000 square feet, 12,000 into. The requests for proposals were reissued in 2011 to allow for a longer lease. In 2017, the architecture firm WXY announced a $136 million renovation of the Busch Terminal plot between 41st and 51st Streets. WXY master plan for the site, which would be renamed the Made in NY campus, would be carried out in conjunction with other firms. The Made in NY campus would include a 100,000 square foot 9,302 studio complex for film and TV, as well as a 200,000 square foot 19,002 area within 2 existing buildings, which would be refurbished into a hub for fashion manufacturing. The renovations would include a public plaza outdoors, as well as an entrance to the nearby Busch Terminal Piers Park, and would be completed by 2020. The proposed Made in NY campus was controversial since it would displace existing small garment manufacturers. The NYCEDC started soliciting proposals for tenants at the Made in NY campus in August 2018. In 2020, Steiner Studios signed a deal to build a new studio at the city-owned portion of Busch Terminal, where it would erect a studio of 525,000 square feet, 48,802. Industry City redevelopment. In 2000, during the dot-com boom, the New York City government planned to turn part of Industry City into a technology campus as part of its Digital NYC program, in conjunction with SBID and Industry City Associates. The project called for installing high-speed optical fiber cables at Industry City, which would be funded by a $250,000 grant to SBID. Upon the completion of the project, Industry City would be integrated into the then-new Sunset Park Technology District. As part of the project, 2 buildings at Industry City would be dedicated specifically to housing electronic machinery, and backup generators would be installed in the spaces between buildings. A 3rd building, the Brooklyn Information Technology Center (BIT), Industry City began attracting artists in 2009 by building 30,000 SQ/FT 2802 of artist studios and conducting creative events such as film screenings and art installation, such as the Marion Spore Project. Industry City hosted Brooklyn's Fashion Weekend, a biannual exposition showcasing the work of local and international fashion designers, in 2013. By 2012, Industry City was only 66% occupied and its tenants employed 2,500 workers. A consortium composed of Belvedere Capital Real Estate Partners, Jamestown Properties, and Angelo Gordon and Company purchased Industry City in 2013. The new owners intended to renovate the complex into a manufacturing and office hub. The Industry City Ownership Consortium also pushed to lease the vacant space at Industry City. In 2014, the NBA Brooklyn Nets announced their intention to move their training center to Industry City. The new facility, the Hospital for Special Surgery Training Center (HSS Center), was to be built on the roof of an empty warehouse in the complex, occupying 70,000 square feet, 6,502 of space in total. The renovation project will cost roughly $50 million. The center opened in February 2016. A job training center for Sunset Park residents, called the Innovation Lab, opened at Industry City that April. By December 2016, the tenants at Industry City had a combined 6,000 employees. Industry City's owners announced a $1 billion renovation plan in March 2015. The plan originally involved adding dormitories for college students, but the dormitories were canceled in 2016 after public opposition. A 500,000 square foot 46,000 m2 area in Building 19 was also to be renovated into a space for technology tenants. As part of the renovation plans, the Industry City Ownership Consortium proposed an expansion plan in October 2017, which would rezone the campus and add 3,300,000 square feet, 310,000 m2 of commercial space to Industry City. Organizations such as UPROS brought up concerns about the expansion because it might possibly accelerate the gentrification of Sunset Park. In March 2019, Industry City postponed its rezoning application because politicians objected that the community had not been given sufficient time to provide input. The project was officially canceled in September 2020 because of opposition from City Council member Carlos Menchaca and local community groups. A Japanese-themed food court was announced for Industry City in October 2017. The food hall, called Japan Village, opened in November of the following year. In addition, the New York City government proposed adding a film studio in Industry City in August 2018. Legacy. Busch Terminal was not only one of the first and largest integrated cargo and manufacturing sites in the world, but also served as a model for other industrial parks and offered employment to tens of thousands of workers. Besides funding other important buildings such as the Busch Tower and Busch House, it served during both World Wars, influenced the design of the Brooklyn Army Terminal, and affected the growth of Brooklyn and New York City. 171 by the mid-2010s, Industry City had been inhabited by a diverse mix of businesses encompassing artisans, garment manufacturing, data centers, and warehousing. Busch Terminal Piers Park. Busch Terminal Piers Park is a 24-acre 9.7 ha green space between 43rd and 50th Streets that contains a pedestrian and bike path as well as baseball and soccer fields, tidal ponds, a wooded area, and access to a pier. The planning and design process for the park, encompassing Piers 1 through 5, began in 2001, and construction on the park began in 2012. Busch Terminal Piers Park opened in November 2014 with one entrance at 43rd Street. A second entrance to the park at 50th Street started construction in November 2016 and opened in July 2017. Busch Terminal Piers Park is part of the Brooklyn Waterfront Greenway, a 14-mile 23 km off-street path. The Greenway is planned to connect neighborhoods along Brooklyn's waterfront, running through the Industry City complex, to the 23-acre 9.3 ha Owl's Head Park in Bay Ridge, which is also served by the Sunset Park Greenway. Transportation. MTA regional bus operations B35 and B70 routes terminate near Industry City, while the B37 route stops along 3rd Avenue, close to the complex. The closest New York City subway station to Industry City is at 36th Street and 4th Avenue, served by the D, N, and R trains. The 45th Street subway station, served by the R train, is closest to the NYCEDC section of Busch Terminal. Formerly, a Staten Island ferry route ran from a ferry slip at 39th Street within Busch Terminal, now the site of the South Brooklyn Marine Terminal, to the St. George Terminal in Staten Island. The ferry route was discontinued in 1946 after a fire at St. George Terminal. In January 2020, the New York City Economic Development Corporation announced that NYC Ferry would construct a new stop at 42nd Street near Industry City/Busch Terminal, which would open in 2021. The South Brooklyn route, which at the time ran between Pier 11/Wall Street in Manhattan and Bay Ridge in Brooklyn, would have its Brooklyn terminus truncated to Industry City/Busch Terminal when that stop opens.